Let's dive in and try to understand what an unstructured interview is and why it is not a good idea to use it. An unstructured interview is basically a conversation with an applicant. And that sort of thing will happen at a career fair or will happen at a job fair like on a college campus where people walk up to the desk, we have a conversation, but we're not screening people in those situations. So it may feel like an interview, but really what it is a conversation. The problem with the unstructured interview, because it's a conversation, it doesn't have any structure and it doesn't ask the same questions and cover the same topics from person to person. And because of that, it has incredibly low validity because it is not really able to reliably predict who is going to be a good performer. So often people use them and they think, oh, we're just going to have a conversation. It's going to be awesome. And in fact, it really shouldn't be a part of our hiring process at all. And it really should be eliminated. If you're going to ask questions in an interview, you have to ensure that you are asking the exact same questions of everybody in the interview, rather than simply only asking whatever you feel like asking. Because if you're not asking the same thing, you're not having the same data in which to then evaluate people. So if you don't have comparable data, then there's no way that you can say, well, this person was better than this person, because you don't have the same information on which to make that judgment. So the only thing that this has been that this is really good for is assessing interpersonal skills and personality. So if that's what you want to do, it is only one of a multitude of things that you need to be doing. And honestly, there are better personality tests out there than an unstructured interview. Yes, they cost money, but they are much more valid than an unstructured interview. And I think, in my opinion, you can still assess interpersonal skills in a structured interview, because at the end of the day, a structured interview is still a conversation with an applicant. It's simply structured in such a way that I'm asking the same questions of everybody, and I can still have the same conversation with everybody. The structured interview, as I said, is about asking the same questions of everybody. They have incredibly good predictive validity. It's not the most valid, highest validity test, but it is pretty darn good. And I highly recommend doing either a situational interview or a behavioral interview when you are doing that. A situational interview is where you set up hypothetical situations. Here's a scenario. Tell us how you would do it. Because listening to the way someone reasons through a problem gives you a pretty good indication how they will actually reason through these issues when they are on the job. A behavioral interview is similar, except that it's not a hypothetical situation. We're asking them to share with us a situation in the past. Tell me about a time when you disappointed your boss. What happened and how did you handle it, and what lessons did you learn from that experience? That's a perfect behavioral interview question, because I'm getting something really substantive about the individual. It's very thoughtful because it gives me a sense of how they're going to handle things in the future. Or they can tell us that they've learned a lesson and they would never do that again. And at the end of the day, our goal is to really get as much personal and valid, meaningful information about our job candidates. The best way to do that is A, with a structured interview, and then B, either situational or behavioral or a combination of the two when you are setting up your questions. So what are some of the best practices to improve interview structure? Number one, making sure you have job-related questions related to things that the person is actually going to do, things that are in the job description and the specification. Making sure that you ask the questions that are related to what the person is going to be doing on the job, and do it consistently across the board. Everybody gets the same questions. Everybody then is able to be evaluated based on the same criteria. The most important thing after that is to make sure you are training the interviewer so they know what they need to do and, in fact, are willing to take good notes, to know how to take notes, to know what they should be writing down, and making sure they're keeping track of the most essential issues that come out of those interviews. Some of your best practices also is about making sure you have more than one interviewer. If you can do a panel interview, that's great, like 2 or more people in the room while you are doing the interview questions. That would be ideal. Make sure you've got a rating scale so that when you have the questions, you can then evaluate what would be appropriate answers and evaluate the applicant's answers against the rating scale. Because this makes things a lot easier. So if they answer a question related to a really extraordinary answer, then you give them a higher score. And for those that give you mediocre answers without a lot of detail, then they would get a lower score. And it really helps you to stay anchored to the essentials that you want to be evaluating. It's kind of like a rubric, right? Like you guys all learned about rubrics because we have rubrics in all our classes. The rubrics are basically what you do when you want to set up interview questions. You create a rubric to grade the answers to those questions. Personality tests, as I've said, are quite good. They are better than the unstructured interviews. The most common personality test is what we call the 5-factor model, or the Big Five, and you use the acronym OCEAN, which is openness to new experiences, conscientiousness, extroversion versus introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism versus emotional stability. And the assessments get at how open people are, how neurotic they are, how agreeable they are, how extroverted versus introverted, and this gives you some foundation to what their personality is like. Now, I will tell you that the validity of personality tests are not as high as the structured interviews. However, they are still pretty good, and you can use them in conjunction with structured interviews to kind of address different aspects of what you're looking for in a job candidate. Often, though, people will lie on those personality tests, or they will answer in the way that they think is socially acceptable, or how they think the person wants them to answer, without really answering it truthfully. So that is a downside of personality tests. But that's a risk that you take with structured interviews as well, right? Because I could lie. I could say I did something that I didn't really do. I could make up stories. Being misleading is a fairly common thing in job interviews, and the goal is to try to sniff out who you think is being authentic. And one of the best ways to do that is to figure out how you can compare and contrast their answers and see where you notice inconsistencies in how they answer things. And that really requires you to take really good notes and make sure that you've got a good bunch of evidence to say this is what they said, this is where there were some inconsistencies, and this is not somebody we want to have working for us if that's the case. Speaking of lying on tests, we can give people integrity tests. They're fairly common, and what we're getting at is the probability that someone might lie or cheat, because we want people with high integrity, particularly for jobs that involve money or highly sensitive information, or they are in a very vulnerable place where they have access to things that they could use in an inappropriate manner. So there are 2 basic types of integrity tests. One is a personality-based test that has kind of subtle wording, and there's inferences made between the subtle wording and whether or not someone is actually going to behave inappropriately or without integrity. Then you have really overt tests that are pretty much ask them about negative behaviors at work, whether or not those behaviors are acceptable, and have they ever engaged in them. And, don't say I've never lied, because we all have lied at some point or another. Don't say I have never, I've never stolen anything if you've stolen something, because that is the overt test is actually looking for you to lie on the test about lying, so as weird as that sounds, they've been able to design tests that really get at some of these issues. So, they're an important test, again, for highly sensitive jobs with highly sensitive information and access to money. So we want to make sure we are providing integrity tests for those individuals in those positions. Cognitive ability tests are getting at the way that we think about things, and these are incredibly valid. They're among the most valid tests that we can use. They have very low cost and very high utility, and so that is what we want. We want tests that represent very, very high utility for us and don't cost us a ton of money. The problem is that sometimes cognitive ability tests can be prone to disparate impact, an unintended impact on groups of people. Because often cognitive ability tests are getting at cultural knowledge and not necessarily intellectual knowledge. For example, a number of years ago, when they did a cognitive ability test, it had the question, cup and blank. The answer was cup and saucer. But if you grew up in a household that never had a cup and saucer, that you only had mugs, or you only had, a glass to drink out of, and nobody had, saucers or plates, to go with their teacups, you know, then you wouldn't know that that is true. And that doesn't mean you're stupid, doesn't mean you're not intelligent. It simply means you were not exposed to that information. There's a lot of cultural norms that I haven't been exposed to compared to other countries, and I would probably fail those cultural norm tests if I took them, as would any of us, unless we have spent time in those countries and learned about them. So it is very important that we make sure that we um, check into the disparate impact or the adverse impact of those tests to make sure they're not differentiating inappropriately between groups in a way that we didn't expect or want to see. And then we can balance the use of these tests with other tests that are not biased and creating a problem with disparate impact. And so when we use them in conjunction with other tests that don't have an adverse impact, then that can improve our selection process and the validity of our selection process. The last one on this list that they talk about is an emotional intelligence test, and it is an ability test. If you have a really good ability test, testing for emotional intelligence is really important because it is an important ability. It's not about emotions. It's about making sure that it's not about the emotions themselves, but it's about how do people think about and manage their emotions. Because we want people to be emotionally intelligent as leaders. And the more emotionally intelligent they are, the better the leaders they are. And this is, hands down, years of research on EI, emotional intelligence, shows us that some of the best leaders have really good emotional intelligence. Next, we'll talk about work samples or judgment tests and things like that. Work samples are, the applicant produces a work sample. Like, I want you to make a thing, and then the applicant comes in and makes the thing, or tell me how you would go about in the steps to do something, and they tell you the steps to do something. So they produce that information, and these are highly valid, content valid tests. They're very expensive to do, though, because you have to set up a hypothetical situation and have them actually do the work. So it takes time and effort and money to be able to do it. But if you have a job that requires very precise work and a high level of skill to do that particular work, it is worthwhile sometimes to spend the money. I wouldn't spend it on screening out all my applicants, but I might use it for a subset of my applicants, the best of my applicants that have gotten through the screening, and I might use it for the finalists that I have to have them assess, based on their ability to do the work. Then we have situational judgment tests. These are what we call a low fidelity simulation, which is it's not a perfect simulation. It's very similar, in fact, to the HR simulation that you are doing for this class. It is a low fidelity simulation. Why? Because you're not really hiring people in the way that you would normally hire people, right? You would need to go through and you screen people and you interview them and then you have them take assessments and then you choose the best candidate. You simply go, I want to hire 15 people, and the simulation assumes that, right? So the low fidelity simulation is the issue here. And it's good because it gives you a good sense of things. It's not perfect. A high fidelity simulation really emulates almost perfectly a scenario, and this is not high fidelity in that sense. And it's done in this way because we want a large number of people to be able to take them. So it can't be that detailed and costly to give. So we want it to be something that can be mass produced, and this way it's a lower cost for us, but it still gives us some good insight. I wouldn't again use it as the only tool, but even a simulation, even a low fidelity simulation, gives us a good sense of how people are going to reason through things for their jobs.